Today, we welcome every one of you to our captivating talk with historian and author Fergus Bordewich. The Capitol Historical Society, chartered by Congress, a nonprofit organization, is designed to tell the story of the Capitol and the people who work there in a manner that inspires informed patriotism. Today is clearly part of that effort. We're going to discuss Mr. Bordewich's new book, KLAN WAR, Ulysses Grant and the Battle to Save Reconstruction, which is actually a story not just about President Grant, but about the role that Congress actually played in all of this activity, because he found the results of one of the very first investigative committees of Congress, a multi-volume report of the investigation on the Ku Klux Klan that went throughout the South. And that story is told throughout his book, which talks about the bloody Reconstruction era roots and how that really influences what's going on today. This story, he will tell, details how the federal government wielded its power to try to dismantle the Ku Klux Klan, defined as the first organized terrorist movement in American history that rose out of the ashes of the Civil War. At the peak of its, power in the early 1870s, the Klan boasted tens of thousands of members. No small member of them, landowners, law enforcement officers, doctors, journalists, churchmen, future governors, and congresspeople. To repel that virulent tidal wave of violence, President Grant waged a two-term battle against both the armed Southern enemies of Reconstruction and Northern politicians seduced by the visions of post-war reconciliation, testing the limits of the federal government in determining the extent of states' rights. You will hear from our author how he transports us into that time. Fergus Bordewich is the author of 8 previous books, all nonfiction, including Congress at War, How James Madison, George Washington, and a group of extraordinary men invented the government, and so many more. He's an independent historian and has been a writer since the early 1970s. We are so honored to have him here with us today to tell what he learned in his book, to share the story of his book and of the KLAN War. And he will be with us for a good set of questions, so you can put your questions in the Q&A. But first, we're going to hear from our author. Fergus, take it away.
Especially, of course, thank you to the U.S. Capitol Historical Society, one of my absolute favorite organizations in America. And I appreciate your having me there. And hello to everyone who's on this Zoom, wherever you may be. I'm not going to read anything from the book, but I am going to open by reading a very short quote from W.E.B. Du Bois, which in a sense explains why I wrote this book, or at least puts what I've done here in context. W.E.B. Du Bois, I don't think needs any explanation. He wrote in 1935 in his book, Black Reconstruction, which should be much better known and more widely read than it is. At any rate, this is what he wrote, 1935. One is astonished in the study of history at the recurrence of the idea that evil must be forgotten, distorted, and skimmed over. The difficulty, of course, with this philosophy is that history loses its value as an incentive, an example. It paints perfect men and noble nations, but it does not tell the truth. If, he says, we are going to use history for our pleasure and amusement, for inflating our national ego and giving us a false but pleasurable sense of accomplishment, then we must give up the idea of history either as a science or as an art. And what this is about, what he's saying here is that we can't afford to obscure or erase or hide or airbrush out aspects of our past, even if those aspects are troubling. And that's what happened with the history of Reconstruction for 100 years or more. Those of you who may have been educated as I was back in the 1950s and 1960s probably learned very little about Reconstruction, very little about the historical Ku Klux Klan, and next to nothing about the extremely violent terrorism that was perpetrated against Black freed people and white Republicans by the Klan in the late 1860s and early 1870s. So I wrote this book in part, I had several motives, but in part, because I wanted to show that organized terrorism has roots deep in American history. Today, when we talk about terrorism, we think of it as something foreign, ISIS or Al-Qaeda or lately Hamas. But in fact, it's embedded deeply in American life and in American history. And deeply troubling about that history, is that it was perpetrated by otherwise respectable, often middle class or even upper class Americans. There's kind of a myth that the Ku Klux Klan was made up of losers and louts and hooligans and so on. But in fact, it was largely founded and led by educated people. Its 6 founders were all college graduates in Tennessee, 1866. And its leaders almost everywhere, as Jane said in her introduction, were professional people, landowners, lawyers, doctors, sometimes churchmen, journalists, and so on. They were community leaders, which makes what they perpetrated all the more disturbing. They can't be written off by dismissing the kind of people who made up with the Klan. So I'm going to talk about a couple of things here. I'm going to talk about what the Klan was, the Klan of the 1870s, and then I'll talk about how the federal government coped with it, and in which, yes, as Jane said, Congress as well as President Grant played pivotal roles. So insofar as we think of the Ku Klux Klan today, it's most often, I think, the Klan of the 20th century. Many of us remember its more recent ascendancy in the 1960s and so on, in reaction to the Civil Rights Movement. The original Ku Klux Klan was founded, as I said, in 1866 in a small city, large town, Pulaski, Tennessee, which is south of Nashville. It was founded by a group of Confederate war veterans, young men who were bored and fishing around for something interesting to do. So they created this, what was at the beginning, a kind of local fraternity that dressed up in weird costumes and popped up in odd places around town. And among their other entertainments, which is how they saw it, was to scare local Black people. What's going on? What's the context of the time? This is early Reconstruction, just after the end of the Civil War. Freed people, nearly 4 million freed people, are for the first time able to assert themselves as Americans, if not wholly yet as citizens, that comes a little bit later, but as at least free individuals. And you have to think of what's taking place in the South as a racial revolution that's going to change social, political, and economic relations across the South. That revolution provokes a reaction, a violent reaction. That reaction is spearheaded by the Ku Klux Klan. So this rather small group in Pulaski, by the way, they called themselves the Ku Klux Klan. Why? They were experimenting with different oddball names. It doesn't mean anything. It has no secret meaning at all. Although the Klan was very secretive in its organization, the name meant nothing. It was meant to sound a bit weird and spooky, and it is. They tried other names which were less catchy, that fell by the wayside. A few months later, a group of former high-ranking Confederate officers meeting in Nashville, recognizing the spread of this weird organization not far away around Pulaski and adjoining counties, set out to transform the Klan specifically into a terrorist and political organization. The Klan, for the most part, across the South, as it very rapidly expanded, became the paramilitary arm of the Southern Democratic Party, the reactionary party of its time, the party bent on destroying, subverting Reconstruction and preventing now free Black Americans from participating in public life. Its political goal was the destruction of an embryonic two-party system in the South. The Republican Party is brand new. It's biracial. Virtually all freed people, once they can participate in politics, become Republicans. They're joined at the beginning by a significant number of white Southerners who were demeaned as time goes by with this term scalawags, which is an insult, of course. But white Republicans span quite a wide range. They're often victims of the Klan too. So it's important to realize that the Klan's primary goal was political, to destroy this embryonic Republican Party, as well as to scare freed Black people out of public life. So at any rate, the Klan metastasized very quickly in 1867, 68, 69. How did that happen? Well, the Klan recruited at the beginning Nathan Bedford Forrest. Those of you who know Civil War history will recognize his name. He was an extremely wealthy pre-war slave trader based in Memphis. He made a fortune buying and selling human beings. He served as a general in the Confederate Army during the war, a very talented cavalry commander. A very talented cavalry commander who led his cavalry often as a kind of guerrilla force behind Union lines. And that's significant in the way that the Klan, in the tactics that the Klan adopted later on. And Bedford Forrest was also a war criminal. He presided over the massacre of a Black Union garrison in 1864 at Fort Pillow in Tennessee. He originally boasted about it. Then when it was clearly was so shocking that it was bad publicity even for the Confederacy, he backed off and denied it. And after the war, he had military charisma, let's say, military charisma. He was recruited by the founders of the Klan to become its first Grand Wizard. And in that role, but traveling more or less undercover, he traveled around the South, helping set up dens, clans, as they were called, usually 10, 20, 30 people to a group. One county might have many clans. They metastasized. They as I said, spread very quickly. Wherever dens popped up, violence soon followed. The violence perpetrated by the Klan was often savage. It involved, at a minimum, the intimidation of Black free people and white Republicans, floggings, stabbings, beatings, shootings, rapes, abuse of women and children, sometimes truly barbaric tortures, which I'm not going to describe here. I try not to dwell beyond the necessary amount on this in my book, but it needs to be clear what was perpetrated and why the Klan was as terrifying as it was, and what terrorism really was like in the hamlets and towns of the South. So that's how the Klan came to be. And I want to say at this point, the Klan was not a continuous organization. There were three clans. There was the Klan I'm talking about of the 1860s and 70s. The Klan was crushed by Ulysses Grant and the federal government in the early 1870s. The Klan is reinvented in the 20th century. It's probably the only terrorist movement inspired by a movie, the famous film Birth of a Nation. The second Klan, therefore, developed in the 1910s, flourished in the 1920s, and faded at the end of that decade because of its internal corruption, and was then essentially refounded after World War II in reaction to the civil rights movement. So we have to think of three clans, not a continuous organization. Obviously, the second and third clans based their style, their paraphernalia, and their tactics on the first Klan. But this is what we're talking about here is the mother Klan, so to speak. Okay, so how many members did the Klan have? It's unknown. That is unknowable, except that membership in some counties, many counties, is documentable at being more than 50%, sometimes 60, even 70% of the white male population. Total number, probably a couple of 100,000. The Klan was as secret as it could be, but that said, its members were often very widely known in their communities because they arose from those communities. What were the disguises about? Partly to terrify people, partly to grant anonymity to people who participated in terrorist acts, and anonymity allowed men to do things that they might not do if their faces were seen even by their fellows in the Klan. Initially, the federal government is unable to cope with the Klan. There's a kind of myth that the South was under military occupation during Reconstruction. In 1865, at the very end of the war, July of 1865, there were about 1 million federal troops in the South. They were demobilized very rapidly. Northerners didn't want to pay for an army that size anymore. By 1868, there were 12,000 troops spread all across the South. North Carolina had just a couple of hundred. Mississippi at one point had fewer than 200 for the entire state. This doesn't constitute military occupation. Nearly all these were infantry. It's rather hard, if you think about it, for an infantryman to catch a Klansman on horseback. So the Klan carried out its terrorism virtually with impunity for years. The Andrew Johnson administration was not very interested in prosecuting the Klan. In addition, the Klan intimidated or co-opted local law enforcement, judges, juries, and so on. So there was very, very little prosecution. People who testified in Klan trials were often murdered. That was part of the terrorist goal of the Klan. So how does government deal with this, finally? Crucial is the passage of the 14th Amendment, which extends civil rights, or citizenship rights, let's say, citizenship rights to freed people across the South, and seems to provide a guarantee that those rights will be protected. There is a great debate. It's taking place in Congress. It's taking place across the country about what entity can enforce civil rights. Traditionally, insofar as civil rights can be enforced, it's by the states. You think states' rights was as a political argument died with the defeat of the Confederacy. It didn't. It persisted well after the war, still with us today, obviously. So it was generally presumed that states, it was the duty of states to enforce civil rights and to protect citizens. Well, most states didn't, particularly when there were no federal troops, courts couldn't be trusted, and local militias were weak or non-existent. In 1871, Congress, I think this will be of particular interest to you on this Zoom today. Congress passes 3 enforcement acts designed to give the federal government the authority to enforce the 14th Amendment in the South. And the third of those acts is known as the Ku Klux Klan Act, and it's very specific in describing and making illegal the behaviors of the Klan, wearing costumes on a public highway, wearing disguises while invading a home, in the middle of the night, in daylight, on public roads, and many other very, very specific details which make it clear that the Klan is the target. Part of what's taking place at the same time, and Jane referred to this, was an extraordinary investigation by the Congress of the United States, by a joint committee, essentially to investigate the Ku Klux Klan. It was probably the most extensive federal investigation to date. It produced an incredible 13 volumes of testimony. I'm going to show you a volume. This is a short one. This is for Florida, the smallest, but there are 13 volumes, thousands and thousands of pages in all. And this committee, joint committee, dominated by Republicans, of course, who were a majority in Congress at the time, took testimony in Washington, on Capitol Hill, in the Capitol building, and also dispatched subcommittees across the South to most of the former Confederate states, where testimony was taken in localities almost everywhere. A few states, it skipped a few states for reasons that we can't get into. And it took testimony from hundreds and hundreds of witnesses. It was the first federal investigation that I'm aware of that took testimony from African Americans, and also the first, to my knowledge, that took testimony from women. Many women, both Black and white, testified, many African Americans, and much of that testimony is extremely poignant. There are witnesses who talk about walking 30 miles to get to the committee's hearing room. There are witnesses who are murdered, it turns out, for testifying. And the extraordinary forthrightness and detail with which African Americans in particular testify is breathtaking. For the first time, Black Americans in the South have an audience with authority that's listening to what they have to say. And they talk in great detail about the difficulties of their life as freed people, the intimidation their family have undergone, how members of their family, even wives, children, have been murdered, tortured, flogged by the Ku Klux Klan, how in other ways they've been punished for trying to vote. This investigation is in large part a huge chronicle of voter intimidation, voter suppression, and of every imaginable type, ranging from putting guns to people's heads on election day to stealing ballot boxes, stuffing ballot boxes, and so on. So this investigation, this report, 13 volumes, was an extraordinary resource, as it was for me. I use it at great length for material in the book. And the questioning itself, and I say this because I think on this Zoom, there are a lot of people who know how Congress works. The interrogation of witnesses is really quite interesting. The committee includes both radical Republicans who are naturally fairly sympathetic to Black and other Republican witnesses, and also includes Democrats, Northern Democrats, who are on the whole very hostile to Black witnesses and to Republicans. And you see them in real time, essentially attempting to undermine witnesses who were telling, we know, the truth about what was happening to them, and taking extraordinary risks to testify at all. These volumes, by the way, are available online. They can be downloaded. They make challenging reading only because the type is about that small. And if you see me wearing glasses, it's for a reason. And there's also excellent material in other sources, which I used to research the book, in archives in the South, and Freedmen's Bureau reports, and also material in the National Archives, as well as material that was very kindly supplied to me by the U.S. Senate Historian's Office, which has always been a great and generous resource for looking at senators during the periods that I write about. So Congress has contributed an enormous amount to providing a panorama with a profound human dimension into the behavior of the Klan in the South. We are seeing in the South essentially a massive political insurrection, guerrilla war by another means. The Klan, as I implied earlier, had kind of adopted the cavalry techniques that Bedford Forrest employed during the war. They attack in the middle of the night. Typically, they attack helpless and unarmed people. There's no bravery in anything the Klan is doing. They are always attacking helpless and unarmed people. And I'll talk a little bit later about what happens when they finally have to face federal troops. So Congress has passed really powerful legislation that gives the president, the executive, authority to go after the Klan, to target the Klan. He does. We're talking now about Ulysses Grant. Grant figures very prominently in the book, as you'd imagine, since he's in the title. Grant evolved greatly from an essentially not very political man before the Civil War, who briefly owned one slave, a man to whom he gave his freedom. He could have sold him. He needed the money. He didn't. He gave him his freedom. To a man who was deeply impressed, one, by the sufferings of enslaved people during the war, and also by the bravery of Black troops during the war. He welcomes Black refugees into his army's camps and supports the recruitment of Black troops, unlike many of his fellow Union officers whose racism overcame their need for the troops. But at any rate, after the war, Grant evolves pretty steadily into a radical, into an ally of the radicals in Congress. Men like Thaddeus Stevens, whom I write about, and others. And what does Grant do? He has a two-pronged campaign against the Klan. One is military. He dispatches more troops into the epicenters of Klan activity, specifically up country South Carolina, where he suspends habeas corpus. He's given that power by the Ku Klux Klan Act, suspends habeas corpus in a group of counties in upcountry South Carolina. The troops he sends are spearheaded by the 7th Cavalry. And many of you, of course, will know that that was the regiment commanded by George Armstrong Custer, which was partially wiped out at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Same soldiers, some of these same men who are fighting the Klan in South Carolina are killed at the Little Bighorn a few years later. They're commanded in South Carolina by a man named Lewis Merrill, a Pennsylvanian who had a sterling Civil War career fighting Confederate guerrillas in Missouri. And he was a rare abolitionist in the officer class of the Federal Army. He's also a lawyer. He's perfectly fitted to go after the Klan because he knows what's legal and he knows how to fight. He's supported and to a degree directed by Grant's Attorney General, Amos Ackerman, another extraordinary individual. All of these men figure prominently in my book. Amos Ackerman, newly appointed Attorney General, he was raised in New Hampshire, but he made his career and life in Georgia, where he was, before the war, a slave owner. He very reluctantly performed non-military service for the Confederate government. But after the war, quickly embraced the Republican Party, embraced emancipation, and became a radical and a leader in Georgia, political leader in Georgia. And Ackerman was a profoundly moral man. He was deeply religious, and he recognized, and I mean, his own notes and letters on the subject are extraordinary. They're mostly at the University of Virginia. He saw deeply into what motivated his fellow white Southerners to commit acts of terrorism. He was appalled by it morally, and he dispatched cadres of federal prosecutors into the South who would prosecute the Klan. So prosecutors prosecute, they're backed up by the army. Thousands of Klansmen are arrested and indicted. Many are imprisoned locally for varied periods of time. In the end, only a comparatively small number are sent to federal prison. So since our time is finite here, I'm going to cut to the chase a bit and say, well, what happened? The war against the Klan, Grant's war against the Klan, was a success. It broke the Klan. The Klan collapsed. As I said earlier, faced with soldiers with carbines, Klansmen surrendered. They caved in. They were cowards fundamentally. They were okay with torturing isolated black and white citizens in their cabins in the middle of the night, but faced with soldiers, they caved in. So the Klan as a terrorist organization collapsed 1870, primarily late 72, 73, 1874. So why then wasn't the Reconstruction Project a great victory? In short, we can talk more about this for those who want to pursue this in questions. Two other things are happening. Gradually, part as a result of the intimidation we've been talking about, the Republican Party has been fractured and in large part broken in many parts of the South, not everywhere, but in many parts. White Southerners have been driven out partly through intimidation and partly through the appeal to race, which divides Republicans, sadly, in the South. And the African-American vote in the South, Black Americans vote initially in huge numbers once they're permitted to, but through intimidation and the manipulation of elections, the Republican Party hemorrhages Black voters, not everywhere, but significantly so, that one after another Southern states are being returned to the rule of the Democratic Party, which I'll say again was the reactionary party, the anti-Reconstruction party, the post-Confederate party of the time. So one after another, Southern states are falling to Democratic control, which gives state governments the ability to restrict voting, to suppress voters by less terroristic means. Terrorism doesn't 100% go away, but it's much diminished. And what else is happening, and this is important to know, that Northerners are losing interest in the South. They are rapidly losing interest in the South's problems, in the problems of African Americans. The public attention, political attention is shifting in other directions. In 1874, which is some might say was the real end of Reconstruction, Republicans lose control of the House of Representatives and therefore the ability to pass money bills. And therefore the ability to support the troops in the South and to pay enough federal prosecutors in the South. It's very expensive. Congress doesn't do it anymore. And as I think probably we all know, in 1876, the Republican Party as a whole, nationally, kind of faces a political reality that leads them to restrict the use of those very few federal troops who still remain in the South. It's not a mass withdrawal of troops because there's no massive troops to withdraw. It's clear even within the Republican Party that their voters will not support Reconstruction any longer politically. So in short, I mean, this is a work of history. It's not a book about present day politics, and it's not a polemic. Nonetheless, I think it's inescapable that there are certain kinds of lessons we have to draw from it. One is almost philosophical, which is that the line between civilization and barbarism can be mighty thin. The line between order and chaos can be mighty thin. We saw that on January 6th, 2021 here in the United States as well. That the potential for terrorism exists in any society, that it's imperative to remain alert to the fact that it can be as American as anything else. And in a country as saturated with gun owning and as characterized as it is today by demagogic politics and appeals to race and resentments, I think we're well advised to pay attention to the roots of possible terrorism and political dissolution in the United States. But I also think this story, this history, does show that decisive action by the federal government, a federal government that takes these problems seriously and is willing to face them squarely, decisive action can work. And that it's a lesson in the importance of government and the ability of government to act creatively, and I say creatively in the sense of crafting legislation and acting boldly. And I mean, Grant was not backed by a unanimous Republican Party or a unanimous American public either. What he did was bold, and what radical leaders in Congress did was bold. It was risky, it was necessary, and it worked. So I think, Jane and Sam, I've probably reached the end of my allotted time here, and I should hand this perhaps back to you, and I can see that there must be some questions.
Absolutely, Fergus. You have gotten our people going. I have 15 questions, so we're gonna go after it. If you can think, some of them sort of go from the question about what was going on at the time, that really was in fact the South in a situation where there was rampant hunger. Was that, that's been part of the mythology? Is that something that was going on, or is that just storytelling?
Okay, well, I haven't yet used the term the lost cause, and I'm going to guess that most people on the Zoom know what I'm referring to. The lost cause is well, it's a mythology. The mythology that took hold in the South. It was ardently and actively promoted by former Confederates and the next generation of post-Reconstruction Jim Crow era leaders of the South, who wrote Blacks and white Republicans out of the story, except as corrupt predators. Okay. The South was not characterized by massive hunger. It was not characterized by something called Black rule. That was an epithet hurled in the polemics of the time. There is no state of the former South that was ruled by African Americans. Did African Americans participate in government? Yes, they did, for differing periods of time in most of the states, from low-level civil offices up to state legislatures. The root of the lost cause is unadulterated and unmitigated racism. There was a racial revolution taking place. The Ku Klux Klan, as the paramilitary arm of the Democratic Party and the above-ground Democratic Party, opposed it in every possible way. They opposed Reconstruction because it would have meant